Okay. When we talk about BVD control and the possibilities we have, let's ask ourselves first, what is the damage that is being done? And Julia and Joe this morning have already pointed out where the problems are. We have reproductive losses, transient infertility, resorption, abortion, and PI calves. And then we have the transient immunosuppression that very much affects herd health, poor herd health, respiratory, intestinal infections, mastitis, and so on. So we have good reason to try to control BVD. And in the early years, BVD was so ubiquitous that people thought BVD control is impossible. And on top of that, the diagnostic methods for controlling BVD were very poor, very bad very bad methods. So can we put numbers in terms of dollars on the BVD losses? There are several studies, and here's only a small collection of these studies that tried to calculate money losses due to BVD. And we have to distinguish two different situations. One is the endemic BVD situation, which we frequently have in many countries. That means the herd is partially immune and only a few animals get infected by BVD. And for these situations, figures have been calculated, and I just give you two examples. In New Zealand, in a dairy herd, in a herd of about 300 heads, it was calculated that about $9,500 per year are the loss. In another calculation, a herd of 250, it was more, it was $25,000 per year. And here are other parameters, losses per 1,000 liters of milk, losses per calving that was done in Denmark by Hans Ho a couple of years ago. So even if you have partially immune herds in endemic situations, the losses are quite considerable. Then we have a far more dangerous situation in totally susceptible herds, where no animals have antibodies against BVD. And when the virus is introduced in such a fully susceptible herd, the damage is much higher. And I have two figures here from Canada and from Australia. And this is $40,000 to $100,000 US. And here it's $150,000 per herd in a herd of 700. And so you see the economic impact of BVD on herds is really big. And even in endemic situations where you have constant losses, which may be under a certain threshold of awareness, if you add up the losses, they are quite substantial. Talking about BVD control, there often has been the misunderstanding that BVD is a normal infectious disease like foot and mouth disease, like herpes virus disease, or any other bovine disease. This is not true, and we have to understand why this is not true. The animal gets infected. Oh, this is the wrong order. The animal gets infected. It develops a transient viremia, and during this period, like in any other infectious disease, it sheds virus. Not much virus, but it sheds virus, and it can, of course, infect the neighboring animal or whatever. The dangerous thing is, and Julia has already explained that in length, that the fetus may get infected, and in this dangerous period for 40 to 100 days, the fetus is not immune competent. And the result will be the birth of a persistently viremic animal that may live for one day up to 8 years. We had in our institute a healthy looking cow of 7 years. She was viremic, and she delivered every year a viremic calf. And these animals shed enormous amounts of virus. And our colleagues in Germany, in the island of Reims, they have calculated 1 drop of nasal secretion may contain 1 million infectious viruses. You can imagine what enormous infectious pressure is put on the rest of the population by these animals. So this is the big difference to any other infectious disease of cattle, and this requires a special strategy to overcome that. Then you have to ask yourself, when we want to control BVD, do we want to do it on an individual herd basis? That is a kind of voluntary approach. You can help the farmer to clear his herd of BVD. That is a non-systematic approach and a voluntary approach. Or alternatively, which is the better approach, of course, a compulsory approach, a systematic approach that is enforced by the industry, dairy industry, for example, or by the government, or by both of them. So we have non-systematic approaches, systematic approaches, control approaches. The first measure, which is pivotal for BVD control, is removal of the PIs. Without removal of the PIs, you can forget any other control effort. And my colleagues have already pointed out, Joe this morning and Julia, how you can test for BVD, how you can find out whether there is BVD in a herd. That's either by testing animals by using PCR, ELISA, or by the Julia smoking gun, whether there are antibodies or not. So PI, and once you've identified these animals, it was common practice, let's say 20 years ago, to sell these animals to the neighbor. That's the wrong approach. You have to slaughter them, of course. And as soon as possible, not have them a few weeks or months in the herd, but slaughter them almost immediately. The second step, of course, is when you got rid of the PIs, you have to prevent the reintroduction into the herd by good biosecurity. And this, at least when I look at my country, this often is a poor, is a weak point. That means physical biosecurity, fences, protective clothing, visitor control, disinfection, things that are quite normal, let's say in well-managed pig holdings or poultry holdings. And then, of course, when animals are bought, and Julia's last slide very well illustrated the risk that is associated with that. When you introduce bought animals into the farm, they have to be certified free of BVD. If one is not sure, they have to be put into quarantine until tested. And then movement restrictions for not negative animals, so that they cannot infect other animals at auctions or wherever. The pitfalls of PI removal, and we made this mistake in the 80s in northern Germany, in Lower Saxony. The pitfalls are when a farm has been freed of PI animals, it relatively soon turns seronegative. That means you have the dangerous situation of having a totally susceptible herd, and when the virus is introduced, the damage is maximal. You have a maximum damage in this situation. You remember one of the first slides with the epidemic BVD. So in these cases, one might consider vaccination. If you have a fully susceptible herd in an environment which might be dangerous, infected environment, vaccination would be another biosecurity tool to prevent reinfection of the virus. And then the last step, of course, is when herds or regions or countries are free, surveillance is necessary to see whether new BVD virus has been introduced. Because as you know, introduction of BVD is not immediately visible. It is silent. It's a stealthy infection, and the effects become visible weeks and months afterwards. Let's talk about vaccination as this additional biosecurity tool. In former years, the prime goal of vaccination was protection against clinical disease. But now we know that this is the prime goal, protection against transplacental infection. We want to prevent the reproductive failure, for one, and then, of course, at all costs, we want to prevent the emergence of new PI animals, given the disastrous effect they have. And then, of course, when you have achieved this, automatically you have protection against clinical disease, improvement of herd health, and all these associated effects of BVD infection that you've heard this morning and from Julia. And then, of course, the vaccine must cover the biotypes that are prevalent in the region. So, which requirements such a vaccine must have? As I said, protection against BVD 1 and 2, that is for the European situation. If there is HOBI, you have a third type, of course, you have to protect against. Optimal fetal protection. Protection should be long-lasting, because repeated vaccination is increased cost, of course. One administration, one injection preferably, that facilitates handling when vaccination is. And then it should be preferable to vaccinate all animals in a herd, because then you don't have to select which animals can you vaccinate, which ones you cannot. And of course, here is the graph that both biotypes should be covered. And this is a small comparison of vaccines that is at least valid for Europe. And I think in Europe we have around 20 different BVD vaccines on the market. And these are the conventional modified life vaccines. The first ones have been developed in the 1960s in the US. And in Europe, as far as I know, there is none of these live vaccines that covers both BVD 1 and 2. They have a safety problem sometimes. They might damage the fetus when pregnant animals are vaccinated, so they are not safe to use for the whole herd, but their fetal protection is excellent, so the immunity is quite strong when you use modified life vaccines. Killed vaccines, again, to my knowledge, there is none that covers both biotypes, but they have an excellent safety record. You can vaccinate the whole herd. There's no risk associated with that. They give fetal protection. However, one must say that they mainly stimulate the humoral immune response and not so much the cellular response, so fetal protection is a bit less than with the conventional modified life vaccines. And then there is an interesting development that was done by my colleague Gregor Myers from the Friedrich Loeffler Institute. He introduced double deletions in non-cytopathic virus. He deleted the N-pro and he inactivated by deletion the RNase molecule in the genome. And the effect was that these crippled viruses, so to speak, could not infect the fetus. So you can inject this double deletion mutant into animals, but it is safe for pregnant animals. They become immune, but the fetus is not in danger. And so if you look at the whole picture, this covers both biotypes. You can vaccinate the whole herd, and you have excellent fetal protection comparable to the conventional modified live virus. So that is an example of what vaccine you can choose to vaccinate. So what is the present status of BVD control in Europe? The most effective, or the early successful attempts were made by Scandinavia, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And they did it by looking for the smoking gun. They did serology because they did not vaccinate their cattle population. They looked for serology, and anytime they found an antibody-positive herd, they went into that herd and looked for PI animals. And the PI animals were removed immediately. The same approach was chosen years later by Austria, and the common approach to vaccination in this case was that vaccination was prohibited, so they could make sure that serology was always applicable and an easy and cheap tool to find new infections. And this, together with very good biosecurity, led to success. All these countries are free of BVD now, or almost free of BVD now. The second approach is a bit different. There you look for the virus in the first place, mainly because in these countries vaccination was in place, so the serology didn't work properly, so you look for the virus. And my colleagues have already pointed out how that can be done, with which methods. And in Switzerland, they had a huge effort. In 1 year, they tested the whole national cattle population, each individual animal for virus. The PIs were removed, and then they checked for a couple of years by ear notch samples and PCR or ELISA each newborn calf for the virus. And vaccination was prohibited. Now they are in a stage that they do the surveillance with serological methods, and Switzerland also is basically free of the virus. Another approach was chosen by Germany, Ireland, Belgium, Scotland. Here vaccination is allowed, and but they also look for the virus in the first place, and these programs are still ongoing. And as I mentioned, biosecurity is a very strong element of all these efforts. This is the example of Germany. We started in 2011 with a compulsory systematic program, and our starting point was 0.48% PI cattle in the population. That means that 3.4% of all herds had at least one PI animal. And here you see the development over the years. The last figure that is available was 2017. Now we are down to 0.01% PI animals, or 0.08% of herds that contain, that harbor at least one PI animal. So you see, it's a quite impressive curve downwards, and I think that in the near future they are deciding to stop ear notching because each newborn calf has to be ear notched and tested. That's quite expensive, and one day they will decide to stop that ear notching, and they will of course also decide to stop vaccination so that in the future they can look for antibodies against BVD to detect new infections. So this was quite a successful approach, and yeah. Of course, one might ask, that costs money. Sure, the removal of PI costs money. You have to sample, you have to ship the samples, you have the laboratory costs for analyzing the samples. Vaccine, of course you have to buy the vaccine, you have to handle the animals, which is from the organization point of view sometimes not very easy. And of course surveillance also costs money, sampling, shipping of samples, laboratory costs, although these costs are not so dramatic because it's basically a serological screening. There's the cost side. I didn't put numbers on that because the costs differ from country to country and they depend on possible government subsidies and so on. So costs are variable among countries. But how about the benefits? And again, it's difficult to come up with unifying numbers on that. But several studies have been made, for example, in Norway, Denmark, Ireland, France, and Switzerland. And all studies concluded that the cost-benefit ratio of BVD control is positive. So to summarize, we do have the tools, we have the knowledge, and we know that the benefits outweigh the costs. So there's no reason not to control BVD. I think it's a matter of awareness and education and the political will to do it. Thank you very much.